On a desolate plain near the Peruvian Andes is evidence that thousands of years ago, man may have known how to fly. Huge drawings are etched in the ground. They make sense only when viewed from a great height. Miles of what look like modern runways score the desert. If they were, what manner of craft landed here? Who were the pilots? We are conditioned to think that flight is the province of modern man. Perhaps we are latecomers to the sky. To this day, the lines at Nazca have not been fully explained. How were they used, and by whom?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
The land we call Peru is both lush jungle and arid plateau. The desert plain called Nazca is host to a strange menagerie, a 9-fingered monkey, a huge, ungainly spider, giant birds and mammoth lizards. They are cut into the dry earth, visible only from the sky. Often, as we pursue our studies of ancient civilizations, we're tantalized by discoveries that don't seem to fit our comfortable notions about the past. Some of these discoveries suggest that early man knew a great deal more about flight than we once thought possible. There are no written records to guide us as we go in search of man's dream of flight, but there are remarkable clues to be found in legend and in monuments of earth and stone. Clues that suggest our remote ancestors were not strangers to the sky, that they may even have had help in realizing their dream. The urge to fly seems to have been a primal one with man, to leave the heaviness of earth, to taste the wind and thrill to the rushing ground below. Every ancient culture known to us has legends of men who flew. For thousands of years, it has been thought that the tragic tale of Daedalus and his son Icarus was but a myth. How, it seemed, could it have been otherwise, that with only wings, a man could fly? Daedalus and his son Icarus were said to live on Crete, center of ancient Mediterranean civilization. The ruler of Crete, King Minos, ordered them trapped in the famous Minoan maze. Their only escape was on the wings that the brilliant Daedalus contrived to build. Daedalus warned Icarus not to fly too close to the sun, or his wings of wax would melt. Father and son soared high into the air, but Icarus was captured by the exhilaration of flight and recklessly reached for the sun. Icarus would pay dearly for his impetuous flight. His wings melted, and he plunged headlong into the Aegean Sea. If the Icarus legend was the only story of flight in the ancient world, it could be dismissed. But there are others. Long after the Minoan Golden Age, the city of Florence dominated the culture of the Mediterranean world. It was in Florence that one of the great minds of Renaissance Europe pondered the dream of flight. Leonardo da Vinci was a classic Renaissance man. For years, he was preoccupied with a flying machine of his own design. It had some of the features of the modern helicopter. One report has Leonardo testing his machine in 1505 by launching it from a hilltop above Florence. History does not record the results of that test. Before Leonardo was born, a structure called the Jantar Mantar was built in India. It was apparently an astronomical observatory. The complex arrangement of its architecture performed the functions of telescope and computer. With its help, the thinkers of India contemplated the stars. Ancient Indian chants contain one of the most detailed descriptions of a flying machine. The chants may have been flights of fancy, or they may have been the accounts of early journalists passing on something they had seen. In either case, the chants describe an airborne vehicle called Varana. A form of energy called Sidley made it possible for the machine to fly to distant stars. It is a curious fact that in some ways the ancient Indian observatory resembles a rocket gantry. Throughout the ancient world, we see time and again an advanced knowledge of astronomy mingled with legends of flight. For the graves of Egypt are dominated by the presence of Osiris, the flying god who brought knowledge to the Nile basin. What inspired the ancient obsession with flight? Why are the pyramids aligned in such a way as to be perfect landmarks for incoming aviators? The thick jungle of Central America was once home for a remarkable people called Maya. Archaeologists believe they flourished in this region for 15 centuries. Then, quite suddenly, the Mayans vanished. They left behind pyramids and temples. Their capital cities must have been lavish. Yet no roads connect these widely separated islands of civilization in the jungle. Perhaps the Mayans were familiar with the principles of flight, for there is evidence that, like other ancients, the Mayans were on intimate terms with the heavens. Certainly, their observatories made it possible for them to construct a calendar as accurate as any in use today. It makes us think that perhaps they, too, knew something of flight. It is 1911. Wilbur and Orville Wright are demonstrating their flying machine for the U.S. Army. Their solution to the problem of flight was to attach a wing shaped like a bird's to a primitive engine that burned oil. It was a solution appropriate to the dawning industrial age. But was it the only solution? Long furrows were cut into the hard soil of the Nazca Plain 2,000 years ago. By whatever method the lines were created, they were meant to be seen from the sky. But by whom? The Nazca Plain on the western shoulder of the Andes in the country we call Peru. The huge designs found on the desert floor that can only make sense from the air have been duplicated in other parts of the world. The Mojave Desert near Barstow, California. Here, an ancient man stares upward. From the ground, it is impossible to tell exactly what shape the figure has taken. How then did a primitive Indian tribe make the drawing?
I got the tether. No, but that's not.
One possibility, one explanation for the method used, might have been the existence of ancient aviators.
Okay, lift up, lift all the way up.
A unique experiment was mounted to prove the point. Could men working on the ground be directed by someone hovering overhead? The site selected for the experiment was the Mojave Desert.
Okay, that's good.
A hot air balloon was the choice for a flying platform. It is a simple device, requiring only fabric and a means for heating air to make it work. In modern times, the first balloon flight took place in France. The year was 1783. The principles remained the same, the technology virtually unchanged. Then as now, there is a purity to balloon flight, an exhilaration undampened by the drone of engines or the blur of supersonic travel.
Directly over it.
Suddenly, from on high, it is possible to understand how a land drawing could have been directed from the air thousands of years ago.
Got it, don't worry.
There is nothing in the Barstow experiment that could not have been done by earlier inhabitants of the desert.
Bring him back over this way. Let's walk him back.
Did American Indians launch balloons? Or are there other explanations? Dr. William Clulow, chief archaeologist at the University of California, Los Angeles, has spent many years studying the mythology of American Indians.
One of the few important practitioners in a simple society like this is what we call the shaman. Many people would refer to it as the healer or the medicine man, but among the capacities of the shaman, we can number in many tribes the ability to take flights outside of his actual body. That is, he projects a part of his personality or his psyche outside of his body, goes beneath the earth, beneath the water, or into the heavens in order to secure some form of an intuitive statement about what is wrong in the society. And he performs healing and curing with the aid of the intuitions that he gets in these projected flights.
Perhaps the symbolism of myth refers to flights that really occurred. Indian shamans may have been intermediaries who traveled between a primitive culture on Earth and a more highly advanced one in the sky. Time and again, in out-of-the-way places where primitive men made their home, there are faint suggestions left of the relationship between man and flight. On a plateau in Peru named for a dead bull, there are drawings more than 10,000 years old. One interpretation placed on them is that they depict the ancients welcoming visitors from the sky. They might be dismissed if it were not for other signs in Peru. Finely engineered roads laid 1,000 years ago connected the mighty cities of the Inca Empire. But the Incas did not possess the wheel. Were these roads runways for another form of vehicle? An airborne vehicle? Is there a connection to flight in the circular ruin of Sacsayhuaman? The calendar ring of the Incas suggests an advanced knowledge of space and time, the kind of knowledge that might have led to ancient flight. But far and away, the most convincing evidence is found elsewhere. A fantastic collection housed in the National Museum of Aeronautics in Lima, Peru, suggests that this may be the case. It is not a collection of precious artifacts, but rather an assortment of stones. The stones were discovered in 1963 in the tiny village of Ica that lies only 40 miles from the Nazca Plain. Bizarre drawings on the stones depict a curious breed of mechanical bird. On another is represented what could be a modern space shuttle. The stones are designed in the same style as Nazca ceramics. The message on the stones is evidently controversial. Representatives of the Peruvian government have been reluctant to discuss them. Golden icons, molded by primitive Indians in the highlands of Colombia, reinforce the notion that somewhere in man's past, the dream of flight was realized. The relics look astonishingly like modern delta-wing fighter planes. Off the coast of Peru lies the Bay of Pisco. Inscribed on a hill is a 60-foot marker. It points inland on a direct line to the mysterious Nazca Plain. The base camp for prehistoric aviation may have been the Nazca Plain. The patterns have been laid out with great precision. Why did the ancients construct the Nazca lines? Nobody really knows. The markings were first discovered in the 1920s by a pilot flying over the plain. Since then, many have attempted to solve the mystery, with no success. For the past 30 years, a German mathematician named Maria Reich has devoted her life to solving the riddle. After nearly half a lifetime of sleeping in an adobe hut and working under a blistering sun, Reich does not know what motivated the ancient Peruvians to execute this grand design. A 1968 study, financed in part by National Geographic, determined that some of the lines have astronomical alignments, but no more than could be expected by chance. And yet, the lines seem to be pointing. Do they point the way to other outposts where ancient aviators once touched ground? It is a persistent fancy we must allow ourselves to have, for there seems to be no other explanation on Earth. it is hard to shake the notion that here, on the plains of Nazca, there once flew ancient aviators. Cape Kennedy, 1970. The forlorn remains of a launch pad no longer in use. Will future generations examine the ruins of our technological civilization and wonder at the purpose of such structures? Will they understand the inner workings of radio telescopes or control towers and see them as evidence that in the 20th century, man was reaching out to the stars? There's evidence that man has lived on this planet at least 3 million years. Were the inhabitants of other worlds idle all that time? Or were they too reaching for the stars, perhaps realizing their dream long before we could even speak it? And could it be that what it has taken us so long to do was merely to copy something we saw in our remote past? The answer may await us in the stars, a reunion of pupil with teacher. It's not so wild a dream. On a mysterious pinpoint in the Pacific Ocean called Easter Island, a gathering of stone giants guards the shore. No one knows who carved them, why they exist, or how the 50-ton monsters were put into place. Yet they're here, unexplainable gargantuan pieces in baffling mystery. In the jungles of Central America, colossal stone heads were discovered 80 miles from where they were originally carved. Weighing 100 tons, there is no clue as to how they were transported through dense swamp, nor do we know who moved them to this remote jungle. Long before the Egyptians built the pyramids, someone constructed a vast stone city atop a peak in the Andes. The ruins stand empty and silent. Each carving is a disconnected figure from the past, yet some common origin might join them together. The earth itself bears the portraits of still other giants scratched onto a plateau in California 10,000 years ago. Others were etched with precision into an English hillside long before the building of Stonehenge. The tools to carve and move the giants indicate an advanced technology. There is a place where the knowledge and skills to create the giants may be found: the kingdom of Atlantis. Never before have explorers been so close to finding Atlantis. Never have we possessed as many clues, nor have we been able to bring the detection equipment of modern science to the search. Until now. broken column may be all that remains of an entire civilization blasted apart by an incredible explosion. Atlantis.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
There occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared in the depths of the sea. So wrote the Greek philosopher Plato in the year 421 BC. Since then, adventurers obsessed by the tale of Atlantis have searched for traces of the remains of the fabled kingdom. Atlantis was said to have been a great city-state, ruled by a race of men supposedly descended from the gods. Was it a real city, a wondrous land, or a myth? A tale created by someone's wild imagination. If Atlantis existed, it would have been a place where technology was far more advanced than anywhere else on Earth. To discover such a city, we may use as clues descriptions that can be found in the writings of the great Greek philosopher, Plato. At first, a small Greek island in the Aegean seemed an unlikely place to start the search, for Plato had written of a great and wonderful empire. They had conquered almost all of Africa, he reported, and more than half of Europe. Such a kingdom hardly fits the image of a tiny island like Santorini. In 1966, however, the remains of an ancient building were dug from beneath 250 feet of ash and lava. Its broken walls signaled the first discovery of a great city. Today, only small villages cling to the Santorini mountainsides. But the island was once a large, circular landmass. 3,500 years ago, it was shattered by an incredible volcanic explosion. All that remains is a thin crescent of mountain and a sullen, smoldering volcano that erupts at least twice a century. The volcano that destroyed the island Plato knew as Thera may also have hidden all evidence of Atlantis. In many ways, the ruins are like those found elsewhere in the Aegean, reminiscent of the Minoan civilization. Then, reading Plato and viewing the broken walls and shattered pots, a sudden, chilling discovery is made. These ruins fit Plato's description of Atlantis with an uncanny accuracy. They constructed buildings about them and planted suitable trees, wrote Plato. Whatever fragrant things there now are in the earth or woods, or essences which distill from fruit and flower, grew and thrived in that land. They had such an amount of wealth as was never possessed by kings and potentates, and is not likely ever to be again. The entire area was densely crowded and kept up a multitudinous sound of human voices, of din and clatter of all sorts, night and day. There were the king's baths, and there were separate baths for women, and to each of them they gave as much adornment as possible. There were many temples built and dedicated to the gods, also gardens and places of exercise. Plato tells us the citizens of Atlantis were skilled engineers, astronomers, and architects. He describes buildings and tools, and time after time we see in the ruins of Santorini the almost eyewitness accuracy of his account. The clockwork gears fished from the Aegean Sea are part of an ancient computer. It was used to plot the course of the planets and stars across the skies of Greece. The first modern computer was built in 1930. Yet these gears were fashioned 2,000 years earlier. Based on a highly advanced understanding of physics, mathematics, and astronomy, there's nothing else like it in classical Greek technology, but it may have derived its origin from Plato's Atlantis. The ruins on Santorini match Plato's description, but one piece of the puzzle refuses to fall into place. Despite the opinion of some experts that here indeed are the remains of Atlantis, Plato himself seems to suggest it lies elsewhere. We must search, he tells us, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Pillars of Hercules are today known as the Rock of Gibraltar. Therefore, Santorini, an island in the Aegean east of Gibraltar, could not be Atlantis. It must lie to the west, in the Atlantic Ocean. In a moment, we shall continue our search for Atlantis beneath the oceans, thousands of miles from Plato's ancient Greece. The geography of the Earth is not constant. Dry land was once covered by ocean. What is now seabed was once mountain and forest. The Atlantic Ocean that now separates the Americas from Europe and Africa is so familiar, it's hard to imagine a time when it was not always there. But once, a great landmass stretched over what is now the Atlantic Ocean, bridging the Mediterranean and the Caribbean. Beneath the surface of both of those seas are the broken remains of ancient cities. They may represent the eastern and western ports of Atlantis. The search for the eastern border of Atlantis begins just beyond Gibraltar in the Spanish city of Cadiz. Once a Phoenician port, Cadiz is among the oldest cities in Europe. Here, Dr. Maxine Asher of the Ancient Mediterranean Research Association met Spanish diver Francisco Salazar Casero. Two and a half miles offshore and 95 feet deep on the continental shelf, Casero found an ancient amphora. It had lain among the ruins of a city older, he said, than any of the Greek and Phoenician remains in the area. And here, the mystery of Atlantis is complicated by the modern world. According to Dr. Asher, the Spanish government revoked their permission to dive at the site. Spanish politics, she says, have prevented further underwater exploration off Cadiz. Although halted, the Asher expedition produced a significant find. It indicates that the east coast of Atlantis might have been precisely where Plato had placed it, as he said, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. There is other evidence to support Plato's description of an island that was greater than Africa and Asia together. Ancient maps have led geographers to explore the possibility that the Antarctic slowly drifted south in the wake of a massive upheaval. Whatever the reason, we know that once it was part of a much larger landmass. The western edge of that land may lie here, beneath the crystal waters of the Caribbean. The actual discovery, however, is no more astonishing than the man who predicted its very existence. These strange blocks were first seen in a vision by the most remarkable mystic of all time, Edgar Cayce. Edgar Cayce was known as the Sleeping Prophet. Hundreds of astonishingly accurate predictions are cataloged in the archives of the foundation which bears his name. In 1939, Edgar Cayce predicted the end of World War II and his own death. Both events, he said, would take place in 1945. He was right. He foresaw the freedom of India from England, the death of John Kennedy, and a number of geological changes that are still to take place. Edgar Cayce's most remarkable prophecy, however, concerns a lost kingdom. Geological upheavals, he said, would bring about the rediscovery of Atlantis. Casey saw Atlantis breaking up into 5 islands. The largest he called Poseidia. And Poseidia will be among the first portions of Atlantis to rise again, expected in 68 or 69. That prediction was made in 1940. In 1967, a pilot flying over the Bahamas sighted a rectangular structure beneath the crystal clear waters. It was precisely where Casey had said Atlantis would be, under the slime of ages of seawater, near what is known as Bimini, off the coast of Florida. And here they lie, huge white blocks chiseled with incredible precision and covering a large area of ocean bottom. No one knows how they got here 35 feet beneath the sea off the coast of Bimini. But here they are found. 2 possible explanations exist. 1, the stones are the remains of a network of paved roads. 2, they are the tops of huge stone walls that once enclosed the palaces of Atlantis. Author Peter Tompkins filmed the work of an expedition that hoped to locate Atlantis using clues from Casey's writings. Aboard were Count Pino Turola, an Italian archaeologist, underwater explorer Dmitry Rebekov, and archaeologist Dr. David Zink. This expedition was to produce one of the most startling finds ever made in the search for Atlantis. Beyond the giant blocks, the divers discovered the remains of several ships. One had gone down in the year 1830. Beneath it lay the fragments of still another ship, one that had sailed the seas more than 3,000 years ago. Not a ship of Atlantis, certainly, but according to Yale's Dr. J. Manson Ballantyne, a voyager from Phoenicia. The Phoenicians were the greatest sea traders of ancient times. Their ships called at every port in the known world. Could it be that Phoenician traders came more than 5,000 miles from the site of classical Mediterranean civilization to deal with a rich and fabled kingdom? The question posed by the wrecks and the blocks of the Bimini Wall remained unanswered as the expedition continued to explore the waters off Bimini. South of the wall, Pino Turola, a leading underwater explorer, discovered 4 marble columns. At first, it was thought they were bits of ballast from a wrecked ship. After days of diving and investigation, Turola developed a different theory. He believes that the columns could be 12,000 years old, actual relics of a center constructed in stone and marble. There are more tests to be made. Geologic dating of these and the expedition's other finds could confirm the explorers' theory that here is Atlantis. Here is the fabled world. Here, ships may have visited a crowded port. Here, marketplaces may have been filled with the multitudinous sound of human voices that Plato told us about. The din and clatter of all sorts, night and day. The broken columns may be all that remains of an entire civilization blasted apart by an incredible explosion. At every one of the sites we have investigated, there are artifacts of a remarkable civilization. But nowhere can we find the remains of the people who once lived in Atlantis. Plato may have explained it when he said the people of Atlantis were warned of impending disaster, and they fled. No one has ever investigated this aspect of Plato's account. But if it is correct, the clues to where the Atlanteans went next may be contained in the giant megaliths that guard the lonely outposts of the world. At Easter Island, atop the Andes at Tiahuanaco, in the jungles of Central America at La Venta, we can find the final clues to the mystery. These monoliths may tell us where the refugees, the engineers, astronomers, and architects fled, carrying the technology and culture of Atlantis. If so, we can begin to understand why the great cultures of the past bear such striking similarities. Egypt, one of the greatest of ancient civilizations, is symbolized by its pyramids. So too does the pyramid mark the ruins of this highly advanced Mayan society. There are other similarities. The Egyptian temple of Amen-Ra at Karnak is aligned with the sun. Only at the time of the summer solstice, the sun strikes the central chamber of the temple, known to the ancient Egyptians as the high room of the sun. 8,000 miles away, in the remote peaks of the Andes, the Inca marked the seasonal solstices with this monument. Using almost the same words as the Egyptians, they called it the hitching post of the sun. Perhaps the most remarkable record of the exodus from Atlantis is preserved in the 1,500-year-old pottery of a Peruvian tribe called the Mochica. In their vases and utensils, they depicted Orientals and Negroes, Arabs, Indians, Egyptians, and Greeks, people who might have been known to each other in Atlantis. In the stones and bones of the past, we've made a startling discovery. There is a common origin for many widely dispersed ancient civilizations. In the tombs of Peru, we see similarities with other cultures, with the Mayans, with the Egyptians. In the development of mathematics and astronomy, we see links that may reach back to a common origin in Atlantis. And most startling of all is the shared belief in eternal life. In fragrant linen, buried amidst the treasures of their world, they seek the hereafter, guided by their ancestral traditions. Perhaps their ancestors were the people of Atlantis. We have attempted to piece together the jigsaw puzzle of history that has been scattered by disaster. In so doing, we've found what may be the only remaining traces of the lost kingdom of Atlantis. Of one thing we can be certain: the memory of Atlantis is no myth. It is history. The tale of Atlantis was first told by the priests of Egypt to a Greek poet named Solon. They assured him that the original archive containing the tale of Atlantis still existed. That was 3,000 years ago. In one of his last prophecies, Edgar Cayce said that the archives of Atlantis would one day be revealed in Egypt. Soon, a new expedition will begin the re-exploration of the pyramids of Egypt, searching among the hieroglyphs and tomb paintings for the absolute proof that once, back before the beginnings of history, a marvelously advanced civilization of human beings once ruled the earth from an island continent called Atlantis. Lost civilizations, extraterrestrials, myths and monsters, missing persons, magic and witchcraft, unexplained phenomena. In search of cameras are traveling the world, seeking out these great mysteries. This program was the result of the work of scientists, researchers, and a group of highly skilled technicians. April 1945. As Allied forces obliterate German cities, Nazi Party functionaries scramble for cover, carrying with them far more than their own worldly goods. From D-Day, the 6th of June, to the complete collapse of German military strength, a brief 8 months had gone by. There had been little time for the looters to hide their ill-gotten wealth. By war's end, hundreds of millions of dollars in jewels, gold, and artworks were being stuffed into strong boxes to be hidden in the most unlikely places. The plunder set off one of the greatest treasure hunts in history. Some of the treasures were buried in an Austrian salt mine during World War II. Some were recovered. Many remain unfound to this day.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
From the east, Russian forces hammer Berlin in the last days of World War II. In the spring of 1945, Adolf Hitler ordered the German army to defend Berlin to the death of the last man. Russian soldiers sealed off Berlin as American troops mopped up the scattered pockets of German resistance east of the Rhine River. In the closing days of the war, every foot of land was paid for with a life. The once haughty German legions defended Hitler's capital city with companies made up of old men and young boys. Russian infantrymen poured into the marble halls of the capital and sounded the death knell of the so-called 1,000-year Reich. Even as the Allied armies were writing an end to the Third Reich in Berlin, Hitler's henchmen were scurrying to save themselves. Men like Martin Bormann, the architects of Nazi power for a dozen years, weren't about to surrender or commit suicide as their leader had done. They had access to the plunder of Europe, gold bullion worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and priceless works of painting and sculpture. They snatched what they could and ran for their lives, some to be caught later, others never to be seen again. Their disappearance touched off the greatest manhunt in history and the greatest search for treasure. As Berlin fell, more than 500 top-ranking Nazis disappeared from sight. They took to the roads, wearing civilian clothes and using any means of transportation they could beg, borrow, or steal. The stolen treasures they carried were to be passports to a new life. The departure from Berlin of Nazi leaders was a far cry from their triumphant marches through conquered cities just 6 years earlier. On a spring day in 1940, the streets of Paris played host to a strange caravan. Riding in an open staff car, selected officers accompanied Adolf Hitler on a tour of the City of Light. In less than 8 hours, Adolf Hitler would leave Paris, never to return. Himself a frustrated artist, he would order his troops to confiscate the great art treasures of private and public collections and bring them back to the Third Reich. Art historians have often attempted to trace the plundering that occurred during the Nazi occupation of Western Europe, but an impossible jungle of documents has subverted most of their attempts. Like children playing with newfound toys, Hitler and Göring examined each new collection that was brought to Germany. Countless hundreds of millions of dollars in paintings and sculpture adorned the walls of the Nazi Museum in Munich. Still other great treasures were hidden in a 15th century castle called Neuschwanstein. The castle was the creation of Ludwig II, the Mad King of Bavaria. In a sense, one madman's monument had become a storehouse for the greed and fantasies of another. For a time, Ludwig's collection of cheap glass and plaster fixtures was dignified by some of the finest works of Europe's old masters. As World War II ended, American GIs were sent to the castle to recover its treasures. What they found were the works of incomparable artists, haphazardly grouped with paintings of little or no merit. A salt mine had been the Nazi treasure repository. In the perfectly controlled humidifier, an elaborate vault had been created in which the paintings could be safely housed. To this day, the salt mine remains. It is possible to enter each of the wood-clad rooms and conjure up images of rack upon rack filled with priceless art. The search for treasure taken from the salt mine was assigned to men like Walter Horn, a German-born art historian who worked with U.S. military intelligence after the war.
I was assigned to an intelligence unit which was in charge of the recovery of treasures, art treasures that had been displaced or stolen. There were two very interesting cases. One of them was the recovery of the crown jewels of the Holy Roman Empire 5 of the most important pieces of which had disappeared. The other one, psychologically perhaps more interesting, because the key figure in that story was a woman, was the disappearance of $2 million worth of gold coins from the salt mines of Alt-Aussee. The only thing that was known about them was that they were last in the hands of an SS major called von Hummel, who was the right-hand man of Martin Bormann, who was the right-hand man of Adolf Hitler. The problem was to find a man who had disappeared 6 months earlier.
Disappeared from a Berlin under fire. Martin Bormann left the bunker where Hitler was to die and made a frantic race for freedom. Years later, his chauffeur retraced the escape route used by Bormann and his men. As Russian tanks bombarded the area around the Reichstag, they made their way across the Spree River. In the very center of the city, they took refuge in an underground train station. In the subway tunnel, wearing civilian clothes, they mingled with frightened Berliners, praying that their meager concrete roof would stand up under the bombardment. Once they reached the western edge of the city, they took temporary refuge in a broken ruin, hoping to last out the day.
I went onto using the normal methods of searching for a man by trying to meet the people who saw him last and see whether his tracks disappeared or did not disappear. They disappeared.
Apparently, the escapees weathered that night in an abandoned building, and the next day set out on a prearranged escape route south. Bormann's face was well known to almost every German. In the chaos surrounding war's end, however, he slipped out of Berlin and made his way to the Alps.
After about 2 weeks in the Austrian mountains, including a search in the Alpine huts and a search in sawmills all the way down from the high Alps to the valley of Salzburg, I had come to the conclusion that he was lost.
Were it not for the dedication of the hunter, the treasure might have been forever lost.
That I had no other choice now than to approach Mrs. von Hummel. At the end of a conversation, rather than interrogation of about 45 minutes, she admitted that she knew where he was and declared her willingness to go and see him and to inquire about the whereabouts of the coins. I left her alone for 3 days, saw her again, and she declared, Lieutenant Horn, I'm happy to report that the coins are in the hands of the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg. I said, this is fine, Mrs. von Hummel, my mission is accomplished.
Other pieces of treasure, however, were not found, and years later would become the subject of life and death struggles. Trainloads of priceless treasure rolled across the German countryside. Hitler's officers made sure the plunder of Europe was complete. It included the most precious thing of all, humanity. Hundreds of thousands of Jews would be herded aboard Hitler's trains. Many would die of starvation along the way. The trains leaving collection centers throughout Europe were expressions of fundamental Nazi philosophy. To be other than German was to be inferior. To be Jewish was to be despised. At the end of the line were the concentration camps. They were foul stockyards of humanity stripped of hope. With the Jews, Hitler found the scapegoat he needed to explain Germany's failures between the wars. The Nazis were stealing lives now, and they weren't above making a profit at it. Grisly crimes were committed by the Nazis in their dozen-year reign of terror in Europe. Worst of these were the assaults on human dignity, typified by the robbing of gold from the mouths of murdered Jews. Another atrocity was the collection of huge sums in gold and diamonds from concentration camp inmates who thought they could buy back their lives. They couldn't, but they made their killers rich trying. The horror of it struck home when the Allies took over the camps. They entered as liberators, but there were no cheering crowds. They beheld instead a tragic spectacle. Combat hadn't prepared them for this. The ovens, Hitler's final solution. Human bones piled everywhere. Clearly, the horrors invented by the Nazis were beyond comprehension, beyond words. Treasure could be recovered, but lives could not. The task would be enormous. Perhaps it would never be completed. The great bulk of Nazi plunder would be recovered immediately after the war. Uncounted millions, however, disappeared with Hitler's henchmen. Men who, like Martin Bormann, are still at large. Among them, Dr. Joseph Mengele. He conducted unspeakable research on the inmates of concentration camps. Inmates would have sooner faced the ovens than Mengele's knife. At Nuremberg, the Allies tried top Nazi leaders captured at war's end. But the colonels and majors of the Third Reich carried their treasures with them into peacetime Europe. Austria's Lake Toplitzay, gold bars and hundreds of thousands of counterfeit English pounds were recovered from the lake in 1957. What better place for hiding treasure quickly than a deep alpine lake? How much remains to be discovered? 2 men have disappeared trying to answer that question. The search goes on in spite of the lake's ominous history. The Austrian government tries to discourage treasure hunters, but the lure of Nazi gold is powerful. 2 volunteer firemen from a nearby city have dreamed of the riches that may lie beneath the lake. The dream brings them to Toplitzay again and again. Perhaps this will be the day. The quest is exhilarating, but not without danger. Vigilance is important. Treasure hunters are optimists, and it is a fine day for a dive. Optimists, yes. But the treasure hunters know other hunters may be abroad. The men who hid the gold were not strangers to killing. Who knows where they are now? The water is deep and cold. It is easy to see how it has kept its secret for more than 30 years. The divers are spurred by the knowledge that the quest paid off once. There was another time when blood may have been spilled to keep the secret of the lake. The secret was born in 1945. The Nazi hierarchy, not killed outright, was in flight. If they were caught, they might lie their way out of long prison sentences, but not if they were caught with treasure. Fortunes must have been hidden in haste. Lakes along the escape route beckoned. Almost 20 years later, some of the treasure has already been found. Perhaps someone was there to make sure no more would be. Did the divers find something? Something that cost them their lives? We only know that they vanished. Some think the underground Nazi movement called Odessa was involved. It is 1976. No one will vanish on this dive. There will be no treasure either. It is possible that the gold remaining in Toplitzay was moved years ago when its guardians felt others closing in. There are many other lakes and many secret bank accounts. Serious investigators don't dismiss the notion that there are still men in hiding who would see Hitler's nightmare world reborn. Great treasure would have to be close at hand to once again unleash the dogs of war. That prospect alone may be enough to drive men to continue the search for Nazi plunder. Florence, the capital of Renaissance culture, is the center for the continuing search for the plundered art treasures of Europe. Rodolfo Siviero is the most active of the art detectives.
Questi sono tutti documenti tedeschi.
He stayed on the trail of Nazi art thieves long after others had given up.
Per portar via le opere d'arte.
Siviero has searched thousands of German documents for clues. With them, he has recovered dozens of stolen masterpieces. Manifests, bills of lading, army memos, reminders of past outrages. The collections of the Uffizi Gallery and the Pitti Palace in Florence have been reconstructed through the work of Siviero and his colleagues. Yet Siviero estimates that a third of Italy's plundered art is still missing. He thinks much of it is hidden behind the Iron Curtain in East Germany. One of his hardest tasks has been to root out the fake masterpieces that began showing up after the war. Museums, anxious to restore their collections, often fell victim to swindles. The flood of copies has made it even harder to trace the fate of the originals. Siviero remains dedicated to restoring his nation's art heritage, no matter how difficult the task. It is important for men like Siviero to believe that beauty can endure. It must endure if man is to banish the ugliness of war. Perhaps, if beauty endures, the flaming destruction of the past can finally be cast aside. Lost civilizations, extraterrestrials, myths and monsters, missing persons, magic and witchcraft, unexplained phenomena. In Search of Cameras are traveling the world, seeking out these great mysteries. This program was the result of the work of scientists, researchers, and a group of highly skilled technicians. Near Innsbruck stands a monument to perversity. Castle Ambras, occupied during the 16th century by Archduke Ferdinand, harbors one of the most terrifying portrait galleries in the civilized world. Painted from life, these grotesqueries reflect the offbeat tastes of the collector. In this gallery of the bizarre are images of those maimed in battle or deformed by nature. One portrait seems curiously out of place. It's that of a king who ruled not in Austria, but in a land to the east, now called Romania. His brutality earned him the nickname Vlad the Impaler. His real name was Vlad Dracula. Centuries later, Dracula's name and the land he lived in would be used to create a character so unredeemed by human qualities that we still recoil in fascination at his fiendish exploits. Dracula, fiction or reality? A search for the truth behind the legend.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
Horror has a special fascination for many, and filmmakers have done their best to exploit that fascination. Audiences have come to know Dracula well. They've seen him portrayed on the screen for more than 50 years. There's the black cape, the jutting canine teeth, the demonic eyes and nocturnal lust for blood. But what of the truth behind the legend? Romania is a land rich in romantic folklore and legends. The tale of the evil Count Dracula is not one of them. The rugged mountains and hidden valleys breed their own mythology. Called Romania's Olympus, Mount Ceflau rises nearly 6,000 feet in the Carpathian Mountains. In pre-Christian times, it was believed to be the home of the gods. Each year, even now, on the first Sunday of August, a pagan ritual is reenacted. Thousands gather by torchlight on Ceflau's shadowy summit to celebrate friendship and love and the renewal of life. During the rest of the year, Ceflau yields its mysteries to few men. Dr. George Iacomi is a surgeon who climbs mainly for adventure. The other, a shepherd, who has spent a lifetime in these alpine meadows. Both know the mountain and its hidden places. Both respect its awesome symbolic power. Though one is a simple peasant, the other a man of science, the mountain has given them a strong bond of friendship. They exchange stories of ancient superstitions of dark, frightening corners where no one has yet ventured. The music seems to recall a distant time in these mountains when ghosts inhabited Ceflau. Legends tell of a 15th century nobleman named Budu who loved the king's daughter, Anna. When he was killed in battle, the grief-stricken Anna asked the powerful witch to bring her lover back from the dead. The witch raised Budu from his grave, but as a ghost. While passing over Ceflau, Budu's ghost was struck by the rising sun, turning him into rock. Till this day, on Ceflau's brooding summit, there is a stone megalith known as Budu's Tower. In the nightmare world of superstition and fear, it often becomes difficult to separate fact from fiction. The familiar story of Dracula is a case in point. Since its publication in 1897, Bram Stoker's classic novel of Gothic horror has been read or performed almost continuously. Yet few are aware that the character was based on a real prince of darkness, whose deeds are perhaps more shocking and more terrifying than those of the fictional vampire. Transylvania, stronghold of legend. A place dimly recalled from horror movies as a dark, forbidding region cloaked in superstition and terror. Here, according to popular myth, live the undead, the dreaded vampires who thrive on human blood. Dracula, written by Bram Stoker, perpetuated one myth that has endured for nearly a century. Along Transylvania's southern perimeter stands Castle Braun. In appearance, it corresponds to the castle described in the novel as the home of the bloodthirsty Count. Haunted by his own childhood visions of threatening forests and spooky castles, Bram Stoker created an eerie world that became more than just a horrifying journey into the supernatural. It was also a parable of Victorian repression. Locked inside Castle Dracula's dark walls were hidden passions and secret longings, which erupted into violence and terror. The German film classic Nosferatu comes closer to capturing the mood of the original novel than the later interpretation of Bela Lugosi. In the book, the hero Jonathan Harker describes his first encounter with Dracula. Holding out his hand, he grasped mine with a strength which made me wince, an effect which was not lessened by the fact that it seemed as cold as ice. Taking Transylvania, a remote place he'd heard of but never seen, as his setting, Stoker evoked chilling images of the living dead. Under the shroud of darkness, the fiendish apparition risen from its coffin begins to stalk its human prey. The nightmare becomes reality. The unknown clutches at our throats. The shrieking of the vampire bat evokes the horror of Dracula. Night-flying hunters, they prey mainly on cattle. But one strange fact stands out. The vampire bat is found only in Mexico and South America. Modern Romanians stubbornly deny the existence of vampire legends in Transylvanian peasant lore. To them, Dracula is the name of a 15th century tyrant whose story, too, was written in blood. Nicolae Paduraru is an official of the Ministry of Tourism. His search for the historical truths behind the Dracula legends brings him repeatedly to a small island on Lake Snagov, near the capital city of Bucharest. It is on this island that the body of the real Dracula is supposedly buried. Nicolae knows the island's history and its few inhabitants intimately. A product of Romania's socialist present, he is fascinated by his nation's turbulent past.
Părinte!
Nicolae is greeted by the abbot, who shares his interest in the story of the bloody king who bore the name Dracula. For the two men, the old church has become more than a religious shrine and national monument. Its ancient doors are the gateway to a mystery that for centuries has baffled scholars and historians. Superstitious romantics have speculated that any robber entering the church would be met by Dracula's ghost, rising in vengeance from its grave. And this, they say, is why he lies buried just inside the door. A more logical explanation was forwarded by archaeologist Dino Rossetti, who uncovered the burial site in the early 30s. The decapitated body was placed in an unmarked grave to prevent vandalism. Saints and kings have begun to fade silently from Snagov's walls. The monastery enjoyed the protection of Vlad Dracula during the 15th century. But when one of the priests dared challenge the king's decisions, he was put to death, slowly and painfully. The torturous method of execution favored by the king was so barbarous, his own countrymen branded him Vlad the Impaler. In Romanian, Vlad Țepeș. Both men realize that the truth about a man's life is often buried alongside his corpse. That the infamous monarch, whose name symbolizes evil incarnate, might himself have been the victim of propaganda spread by his enemies throughout Europe. Seeking the truth can become an exciting adventure, and so a search begins. It will unravel some of the mysteries which surround the life of a king they called Dracula, son of the devil. Transylvania, the heart of Dracula country. Transylvania spreads across northwestern Romania in an unbroken chain of fertile hills and sunlit valleys. Here, the princes of Wallachia sought refuge from fierce Muslim warriors who burned their villages, raped their land, and punished captives by mercilessly driving stakes through their bodies. From the Turks, a young Wallachian prince named Dracula would learn all about impalement. Like an image from an old fairy tale, the town of Sighișoara slumbers peacefully along the gentle slopes of the Transylvanian highlands. Unchanged since the Middle Ages, Sighișoara was once a bastion of Germanic military might and commercial enterprise. In this house, in 1431, a son was born to the fearsome Prince Vlad Dracul, the Dragon. The boy was called Dracula, son of the dragon. A coin bearing the family emblem is one of the few remaining artifacts from Dracula's reign. The symbol of the dragon reinforced Vlad's image as a fearless Christian crusader. As his notoriety grew, the name Dracula took on new meaning. Dragon would be increasingly interpreted as devil. Vlad belonged to an age of brutality. The Renaissance, which saw the rebirth of art and learning, also bred new tyrannies, unspeakable torture, and oppression. To understand Vlad's cruelty, we must also understand his world. The nunnery at Sucevița was originally a fortified monastery, protected by walls 20 feet high and 10 feet thick. The traditional woodblock, summoning nuns and monks to prayer, may at one time have also been a summons to battle. For the monasteries of Romania were more than strongholds of the Christian faith. They were part of a formidable defense perimeter to ward off invaders. It's likely that the young Dracula looked out from the battlements of such a monastery watching men die in the brutal spectacle of war. Steeped in the teachings of the Eastern Orthodox Church, Vlad Dracula surely must have developed strong, simple notions of good and evil, of reward and retribution. The ladder of virtues, the work of an unknown artist, shows that in the climb toward heaven, few are virtuous enough to reach it. Most topple along the way, headed toward eternal damnation. To a young prince, impressionable and bristling for power, such messages were clear. By punishing evil, salvation could be had. Until the 16th century, Suceava was the capital of the province of Moldavia. Here, Vlad Dracula fled, deposed after briefly assuming the throne of Wallachia at the age of 17. This was the beginning of his second exile. The first time, he'd been sent as a hostage to the Turkish court by his father, a guarantee against war with the Sultan. As Vlad waited in Suceava to take power, he vowed to free Wallachia from Turkish domination and break the power of the nobles and church. In 1456, the second reign of Vlad Dracula began. The greatest threat to his power centered in the German towns of southern Transylvania. Of these, Brasov was the largest. Convinced that her powerful merchants were conspiring with his enemies, furious at their defiance of his trade restrictions, Vlad launched a series of punitive raids against Brasov and neighboring towns, taking a terrible toll of their citizens. How many perished by his command, no one can say. That slow, torturous death by impalement was excessively barbaric, no one can deny. Yet since the only written accounts from that time come from Germany, it's conceivable the atrocity reports were exaggerated. Not so the massacre at Târgoviște, Vlad's capital. During his successful campaign against the Turks, he impaled thousands of enemy soldiers outside the city gates to frighten the invaders. He would be known now for all time as Vlad the Impaler. Viewed through the filter of time, another side to Vlad's character emerges. His bold strategies won the admiration of his Turkish opponents, who also regarded him as just and honest. On the threshold of victory, he was betrayed by his younger brother, Radu, and forced into political captivity in Hungary. After 12 years, Vlad was restored to the throne by his cousin, Stephen the Great. Faces from the present. A few among the 1.5 million who live in Bucharest, Romania's bustling capital. In their city, Vlad the Impaler made his last stand. Not far from the center of Bucharest, with its huge outdoor markets, are archaeological remnants of its past. Layers of history, stripped away, reveal fortifications dating back to the 13th century. Below ground level, there has been unearthed a portion of the original castle built by Vlad Dracula. It was in these haunted surroundings that Dracula planned his last campaign against the Turks. His third and final reign would last only 2 months. On December 14, 1476, he was killed in battle near Bucharest, and according to eyewitnesses, beheaded, perhaps mistakenly, by one of his own troops. Vlad's remains were secretly buried at Snagov. In death's darkness, the prince may finally have found peace. If some light has been shed on the truth during this search for Dracula, it doesn't mean that belief in vampires will be dispelled. Bram Stoker's Dracula will always persist in our minds because in him we have found the perfect symbol for unrepentant evil. Nosferatu, Dracula is destroyed by the daylight, dissolving in a puff of smoke. But many would prefer to feel he can still be found, lurking somewhere in the mist-shrouded mountains of Transylvania. Beneath storybook towers, the old Transylvanian city of Sigashora seems untouched by time. Her people still bear traces of their medieval ancestry, clinging tenaciously to old traditions and religious faith. They are steeped in Sigashora's history, remembering that it once was a stronghold of wealth and power, the home of princes, the birthplace of a king. Vlad Dracula belongs to their heritage, Stoker's vampire to our imaginations. Legends die slowly. The myth of the human being who takes the form of a bat and drinks blood will survive because people choose to believe. Vampires, like werewolves and monsters, serve a purpose. They are representations of our hidden fears. By conquering these nightmare creatures, we purge ourselves of our darkest thoughts, and in so doing, reclaim the human spirit. On a remote island in the Pacific Ocean, a frightening and mysterious massacre took place. A race of stone giants carved 1,000 years ago guard the shore in silence, as if unable to endure what they have witnessed. The clues to the mystery remain locked behind mute lips. There is no voice to tell who carved the giants and why hundreds of them were destroyed in the Easter Island massacre. Shattered remains of the Easter Island giants defy mankind to reveal their story.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanation, but not necessarily the only ones to the mysteries we will examine.
In the beginning of time, legends tell us, land and sea were at war with each other. The crust of the earth exploded in fury and sent molten lava boiling into the sea. The lava cooled and hardened into black rock. Eons ago, an island was born, forged in agony and cursed with a destiny that hangs over it to this day. It is Easter Island, a jagged speck of land on the endless seas halfway between the coast of South America and Tahiti. Easter Island is perhaps the loneliest inhabited place on Earth. Its existence was unknown until it was discovered by a Dutch explorer in 1722. The Dutch ship landed on a warm and balmy Easter Sunday. it was welcomed by a band of natives who swam out to the boat carrying gifts. At one time, the population exceeded 10,000. But since that fateful Easter Sunday, slave raids, civil war, and a smallpox epidemic nearly decimated an entire race. Today, less than 1,000 people live in the only village, Hangaroa. The island is owned by Chile, and the official language is Spanish. But the faces of the people hold no clue to the origin of the first islanders. Over the years, the mix of Polynesian, South American, and European blood has blurred lines of ethnic purity. It was on Easter Island that mankind had one of its most curious ideas. No one knows who had it or why. But the inhabitants of that lonely island undertook what is perhaps one of the most amazing engineering projects of ancient time. They did not build pyramids or tombs. Instead, they carved colossal stone idols in the likeness of man. The stone figures of Easter Island are so massive, their size is difficult to grasp. Standing beside them, a person becomes as small as a fly speck. Statues range between 30 to 80 tons of solid volcanic rock. A small one is equal to the weight of 1,000 men and stands as tall as a 2-story house. They cover the entire island. Each has a unique character, some morose and brooding, others almost comical. The mysteries that surround the giants begin with the question of why the islanders created so many of these enormous idols. It is as if their fear of life was so terrifying, they needed a multitude of gods to protect them. Even more mystifying is evidence that many statues appear to have been systematically massacred. Some savagely decapitated and mutilated. A ritual murder seems to have taken place. No one knows who did it or why. The search for answers begins in the quarry, the crater of an extinct volcano, Rano Raraku, a dark and forbidding womb. There are enough questions here to intrigue an army of scientists and fill a bank of computers. But only a handful of men have pursued the quest. Foremost in the search is Dr. Edmundo Edwards, a Chilean archaeologist who has spent the last 10 years probing the riddle of the statues. 500 years ago, the quarry rang with the blows of hammers and the rhythmic chanting of workers chipping stone. Quite suddenly, work was abandoned. Half-finished forms are embedded in the side of the volcano, ranging from embryos to fully formed young gods. Some are difficult to discern because their contours have merged with the crater. Work was stopped so suddenly that the presence of the workers can still be felt. Tools lie in their place, undisturbed for centuries. Crude basalt chisels that were used to carve the expressive faces of the stone gods. Where once the sound of 1,000 hammers filled the air, now there is not even an echo. Once finished, all that remained was to sever the umbilical cord. An elaborate pulley system lowered the statues from the mouth of the volcano down the slope. Here, the monoliths were free to begin their lumbering march to the sea. Ancient legend has it that the stone gods were endowed with a supernatural power called mana, a power that enabled them to walk from the volcanic quarry to the sea. There they stopped, each in its place, and turned their backs to the sea so they could cast their mana over the land. The mana emanated through the eyes. The last ritual act of the carvers was to open the stone lids so the mana could escape. At one time, open-air temples lined the coast. Then, all the statues with open eyes were smashed and desecrated. The work of restoring the monoliths has only recently begun. Mario Arevalo is a topographer and one of the prime movers in the restoration project. According to the most recent count, there are over 500 battered giants on the island, and many are in the final stages of degeneration. Mario and archaeologist Edmundo Edwards wage a desperate battle to stave off the effects of erosion. The work involves the painstaking process of plotting the position and alignment of each statue. So far, only 12 have been restored because there isn't enough manpower or machinery to save more. Somehow, the statues were transported across 20 miles of rough terrain to the sea. No evidence remains of how the engineering feat was accomplished. But a primitive boat rolling method, still used by local fishermen, provides a glimmering of how it was done. The theory holds that the statues were rolled over miles of wooden skids to the beach. If true, this is one of the earliest uses of rollers known to man. Not even the more technologically advanced Egyptians knew of this method when they moved the giant blocks for their pyramids. How did a people isolated by thousands of miles of endless sea develop an advanced engineering skill? The riddle of how the statues were moved has challenged many men to come up with a concrete solution. Diagrams illustrate what the ancient method might have been. For Roberto Forster, a local engineer, the theory of the giant rollers is not enough. He swears he can demonstrate a more practical method. He calls his invention the fulcrumista. As in the seesaw, the principle of the fulcrum is to exert the greatest possible leverage in the lifting of an object. In an experiment executed on a small scale, Roberto intends to move a 5-ton stone to prove how a 50-ton giant might once have been transported. Roberto prevails on the mayor to gather a workforce for his project. He vows he will solve the ancient riddle once and for all. The mayor has doubts, but agrees. The experiment is scheduled for tomorrow morning. The experiment will be carried out on a small scale. A 5-ton stone replacing the 50-odd tons of a monolith. On the appointed morning, a workforce gathers for the momentous test. Roberto's fulcrumista will either stand or fall. Edmundo, Mario, and even the mayor himself have joined in the effort to put to rest once and for all the question of how the statues were moved. A fiasco. Indeed, if the attempts of modern man to solve these incredible engineering feats meet with failure, think of the ingenuity of the ancient carvers. One may well wonder if the peoples of those early times did not have gifts that have been lost to us. The secret remains locked behind stone faces. Faces that remind archaeologists of another face staring out over its mountain kingdom. The place is Tiahuanaco, Bolivia, an ancient civilization built on a bleak plateau in the Andes. Stone gods, separated by 4,000 miles and a span of at least as many years. There is no evidence that there was any contact between the two cultures. And yet, the features bear an uncanny resemblance. With what common spirit might they have been invested? Perhaps one of the 7 written tablets found on the island contain the answer. The pictographs are like those of no language known on Earth. They have not been decoded, but anthropologists believe they tell a dark and bloody tale. There is evidence that long ago the island was torn by terrible civil strife, with brother pitted against brother. The bones of hundreds of islanders have been found in caves that stretch for miles under the lava crust. What were the natives hiding from? Why were they slain? Edmundo ascribes it to overpopulation and starvation. He speculates that in mass frenzy, the strongest killed the weakest and survived by eating human flesh. The survivors set up the worship of a new god, the Birdman, who dove on his prey from the sky. Folklore has it that on the first day of spring, the strongest men would swim through shark-endangered waters to the tiny island that lies offshore. They would search the crags for the Manotaura egg and swim back, carrying the prize in their mouths. The first man back was proclaimed king for 1 year. Perhaps the petroglyphs tell the story of the days that preceded the Birdman cult. Archaeologists have labored since the glyphs were first discovered in 1922 to decipher the meaning of the bizarre symbols. The chalk paint accentuates the designs, but cannot unlock the meaning of the curious etchings. Only a tragic face remains as an emblem of past events.
¿Qué cosa mil?
10, 20, 30.
Ya. Hanere.
The strongest clues seem to lie in the myths and legends handed down by word of mouth over the centuries. Juanito Huera is a noted linguist who understands many tongues. The old woman begins to chant a tale about a war between the long ears and the short ears.
Painai, te vai tutu.
Her story bears the epic ring of heroic battles and great conquests. It sounds like a tale out of ancient Greece, a great saga in which the short ears rose from enslavement, and in a battle that rumbled like the quaking of the earth, slew every man, woman, and child who had long ears. Mythology, with its strange symbols, plays tricks on the imagination. But it springs from real events that once occurred. And there is little doubt that the events on Easter Island have been bloody and tragic. The tragedy was matched by the fate of the islanders and provides a final clue to the Easter Island mystery. History records that thousands of natives died under the guns of their conquerors and from the dread diseases brought with them. The endless waves, of course, have seen it all. They saw brave people put their hope and faith in mighty gods carved from stone, and they saw the failure of those gods to protect them. It was that failure that may have led to the massacre of the stone giants. On a remote speck of land in the South Seas, a great civilization flourished and died. The wide-scale destruction of the giants of Easter Island is symbolic of the tragic destiny of a people. It is also testament to the power of faith. A faith that motivated thousands of men to toil relentlessly on stone monoliths, and a faith so strong that when it was lost, it may have driven them to turn against their own gods with a terrible vengeance.